Parts of the flower. Now, flowering plants are called angiosperms. All plants don't flower. We have the flowering plants and the non-flowering plants. The flowering plants are also called the angiosperms. And the main functions of flowers is for reproduction. In the flowers are located the male and female organs, male and female parts of the flower, and they are involved in a reproduction. So let us go in detail and see the parts of the flower. The flower has got basically 4 parts. The first is the petal. Like you can see here, these are the petals. They're very colorful, different colors, and there's a reason why they are so colorful. This helps for the attraction of insects, to attract insects for pollination. Pollination is a transfer of pollen grains. We will look into that in the next slide. So since they are very colorful, the insects are attracted towards the flowers, and this helps in pollination. They also protect the inner whorls of the flower. The petals, they have the inner whorls, which are the pistil and the stamens, and the petals protect this inner whorls of the flower. Next we go to stamens. Stamens are these green little parts that we see in the flowers. It is the base of the flower, and the function of sepals, first they are green in color, right? And because they are green in color, they will perform photosynthesis. They also protect the flower in bud condition. Like in this picture here, you can see these are the sepals which protect the flower in bud condition, and once the flower opens, the sepals also open up. So they protect the flower in bud condition. Next we have the stamens. These are the stamens here. These are the male parts of the flower. We'll learn more in detail. So the male part of the flower, and then the carpels. There's one central carpel. This is the carpel, which is a female part of the flower. These are the reproductive parts of flower. The first two, that is the petals and the sepals, are the non-reproductive part. So these were the non-reproductive parts because they are not involved in reproduction. However, the pistil and the stamens are called the reproductive parts of the flower. We'll now learn about the female reproductive part. Which is the carpel or the pistil. It's made up of the stigma. So here is the stigma. That's where the pollen grain sits. Then we have the long style. Here is the long style, through which the pollen tube then enters. Then at the base is the ovary, and inside the ovary are the ovules. These are the female gametes. So this constitutes the female reproductive part of the flower. Now for the male reproductive part, we have the stamen. It's called a stamen. It's made up of the anther. Now within this anther are present the pollen grains, and these pollen grains contain the male gametes. And we have the long filament. This is a picture from your textbook. This question could come like, draw the longitudinal section of the flower. So it's very important first you draw your petals. This doesn't have to be any particular design. Then you will draw your sepals, which always have to be, of course you cannot draw green color, but these are your sepals here. Then the central portion is your pistil, which is made up of the stigma here. Then you draw this long, and here the swollen portion is the ovary, and within the ovary you have the ovule, and in the ovule you need to draw your, here this is the ovule within, and then you draw the stamens. For the stamens you need to draw your first filament and these enthalobes. While drawing enthalobes you got to draw two lobes, 1 and 2, in this manner. You have one and then another one, 2 enthalobes, and this is the stamen. So do learn this diagram. Now that we have learnt that the reproductive parts of the plant are located in the flowers, we have two kinds of flowers. We have the unisexual flowers, the flowers that have either the male or the female parts. So you have male flowers that have the male parts and the female flowers that have the female parts. And then the bisexual flowers that have both the male and the female parts. Look up in the first figure here. This is the male flower and this is the female flower. So the male and female are separate. Here also, have you seen the male and female, they are two separate flowers. These are unisexual flowers. And the example of unisexual flowers are like that of the papaya. So you'll have the papaya male tree and the female tree. Papaya and watermelon. These are called unisexual flowers because they have the male separate and the female are separate. Then the bisexual flowers, in which the male and female, both the parts are there. Like here, see, we have the male and the females are bisexual. Here too we can see these are the male part, and this little thing that you can see, a whitish, that is a female. Here also hibiscus is an example of bisexual. You have the stamen as well as a pistil. The mustard seed flowers are also an example of bisexual flowers because they have the male, that is the stamen, as well as the pistil in the same flower. Hibiscus also, you have the stamen, male, and the female pistil present in the same flower. Pollination of flowers. The pollination is defined as a transfer of pollen grains from stamen to the stigma. The pollen grains are produced in the stamen. Here they're produced in the stamen, and the ovule or the female gamete is in the stigma, the egg. So the pollen grain should be transferred from the stamen to the stigma so it can fuse with the egg. This transfer of pollen grain from stamen to stigma is called pollination. Now pollination are of two types. We have the self-pollination, like you can see in the picture. The self-pollination is when the pollen grain is transferred within the same flower. Like here, self-pollination, transfer of pollen grains from stamen to stigma of the same flower or another flower in the same plant. However, cross-pollination will take place when pollen grain jump from one plant to the other. So cross-pollination, transfer of pollen grain from stamen to stigma of another flower in a different plant. So this is the difference between self-pollination and cross-pollination. Now this transfer takes place with the help of certain agents of pollination. Now let's go and see into the agents of pollination. In aquatic plants, water is the agent of pollination. Here you can see the pollen grains. They float over the water and then they are received by the female plant. Wind also is an agent for pollination. In plants that have very light pollen grains, which are very light, it's a wind that carries the pollen grain from one place to another, like in case of wheat and many grasses. Insects are major agents for pollination. When they come into the flower to have the nectar, the pollen grain which are sticky stick onto the bodies of the insects and they carry it from one place to another. So here again we have the agents, the many agents of pollination which bring about pollination are wind, we have water, birds, small birds, insects, bats that visit the plant to have the nectar. They carry the pollen grain from one part to the other. So we have about 4 or 5 agents of pollination. We'll now learn about the germination of the pollen grain. In the first step, the pollen grain falls on a suitable mature stigma, usually a sticky stigma. So when it falls on the sticky stigma, it gives out a pollen tube, like you can see in this picture here. It has given out this pollen tube. This pollen tube then grows along the style. Here we have the pollen tube growing right along the style. It grows down here. It enters into the ovary, and in the ovary you have the ovule. Then it enters into the ovule and fuses with the female gamete which is present in the ovule. So we'll just go to the steps again. So in the first step, the pollen grain falls on a suitable mature stigma, and if it falls on a suitable stigma, the pollen grain then grows a pollen tube. The pollen tube then grows down or moves down the style. It grows inside into the style. And on reaching the ovary, it enters the ovule, reaches the male gamete, releases the male gamete into the ovule, and the fertilization takes place. The gametes fuse with the female gametes. There is something called double fertilization that takes place here, but that will be you learn it in the later part of your study. Now that fertilization has taken place, there will be a few changes that will now follow. The ovule. So let's go and see what are the changes that take place after fertilization. I've taken this from your textbook. So first, number 1 is the zygote divides several times to form an embryo. That's the first. Then second, the ovule develops a tough coat and is gradually converted into a seed. The ovary grows rapidly and ripens into a fruit. Now the petals and sepals are not required. So the petals, sepals, stamens, style and stigma may shrivel off and fall away. So again, I'll just go over it. Important is the ovule is where the fertilization has taken place. That turns into a seed. The ovary turns into a fruit. And this ovule develops a tough coating on the top. That's why the seeds we see have a tough protective coating. So the minute the fertilization takes place, the ovule develops this tough coat around. It's given here. Develops a coat, a tough coat, and is gradually converted into a seed. Followed by the seed formation. Now the seed will then fall in an appropriate condition. It will germinate to give a new plant. Germination of seed. The seed contains the future plant or the embryo, which develops into a seedling under appropriate conditions. This process is called germination. Here is the ungerminated seed. On germination, it opens up and it gives you the plumule, which is the future shoot. Then it contains a radicle, which is a future root, and it contains its cotyledons, which stores the food for the seed. So these are the parts of the seed. Basically 3 parts. One is the plumule. Then we have the radicle. And then third, we have the cotyledons. The plumule is a future shoot, the radicle is a future root, and cotyledons store food for the seedling, or for the seed to germinate. Here I made a mistake. This is not female. This is female here. And here is the male flower.